Welcome to today's webinar highlighting Hawaii's HOPE probation strategy, and you'll learn much more about it as we hear from our wonderful panel of presenters that you'll be introduced to as we move forward in today's webinar. As I have been sharing, my name is Leslie Lemaster. I'm going to serve as your producer for today's event. One of the many roles that I play in the National Institute of Corrections, where I'm a correctional program specialist, is WebEx administrator. And many times for many webinars, some of you who you've been on other webinars, I actually play this role. So today, if you have any technological issues, please do contact me in chat by sending me a private message. So to get us started and focusing in on what we're here to think about and learn about here today, we're going to share about a video on the HOPE strategy that started in Hawaii. So please do turn up the speakers on your computer or your device that you are watching on, and we'll be back in about 3 minutes. So enjoy this video clip.
Eventually, they're going to be released.
What we were doing was not working. Don't get me wrong. If people are violent, dangerous, or they won't stop stealing, they need to go to prison. But the majority can and should be placed on probation. We just have to try to make the probation system work better.
Hawaii Circuit Judge Stephen Alm is the driving force behind HOPE, a revolutionary probation program that's producing remarkable results, dramatically cutting costs, recidivism, and victimization.
The prison system is made up mostly of people that have failed at probation. It's not judges at original sentencing sending people to prison. Judges, most people get put on probation, and rightly so. But it's failing at probation and then going to prison. And then at the other side of it, being released from prison early, going on parole, failing at parole, and going back into prison. So we have a very overcrowded prison system, and the only way you're going to bring that down is reforming the probation and parole systems. I thought to myself, what would work? You know, what would work to change people's behavior? And I thought, well, how was I raised? How did I raise my son? You tell him what, the family rules are, and then if he misbehaves, you give him a consequence immediately. And then it doesn't have to be that severe, but it has to be swift and it has to be certain. So I thought to myself, could we bring that same kind of an attitude and approach to the criminal justice system?
120 days, early release at any time is approved by the PO.
A former criminal prosecutor and U.S. attorney, Judge Alm started HOPE in 2004 with 34 high-risk offenders who were failing at regular probation.
We just said, give us the people that are failing at probation, that are having the most problems.
It wasn't a situation where we cherry-picked people that we thought would be successful in this program. We started off with the highest risk probationers.
And then we're deciding, okay, let's get the toughest of that group and put them into HOPE. Because the research is clear. You should put your resources at those that are most troubled, that are having the most problems, because then you get the best bang for your buck.
Because of its success, HOPE now includes almost 2,000 probationers, nearly a quarter of those on Oahu, all overseen by a single judge.
A lot of us are very skeptical that, given Judge Alm's background, that he would be even remotely sensitive to the needs of prospective defendants and inmates. And ironically, Judge Alm's program, the HOPE probation program, has reflected a sensitivity to the community.
Regular probation is delayed, it's uncertain, and then when something finally happens, it's often unnecessarily harsh. HOPE probation is swift, certain, and proportionate.
Aloha, and thank you for joining us today, live from Honolulu, Hawaii. My name is Greg Crawford, Correctional Program Specialist at the National Institute of Corrections and Network Manager for the Community Corrections Collaborative Network, or CCCN. I will serve as your moderator for this live event. The CCCN is comprised of the leading associations representing pretrial, probation, parole, drug courts, and treatment professionals across the country. Officially established in 2012 as a network, we now represent nearly 90,000 association members through our 7 associations. HOPE Probation was first conceived in Honolulu as Hawaii's opportunity probation with enforcement. Since its start in 2004 by Judge Steve Alm out of the First Circuit Court in Honolulu, Hawaii, there has been significant interest in the approach of HOPE, and there have been many replication efforts all across the country. The objectives for today's webinar are to showcase the innovative HOPE program and how we can learn from it. We want to discuss HOPE's innovative and programmatic design, implementation, and evaluation characteristics, including HOPE's collaboration and systems approach, engagement with staff and fostering teamwork and collaboration, matching probationers to the right services instead of a one-size-fits-all model, succession planning and sustainability to build long-term success, and research and testing the effectiveness of the strategy. And also, our goal here today is to engage the criminal justice system in a live discussion about the HOPE strategy, how to access funding through federal and other resources, and share ideas for implementing similar approaches, and motivating our leaders to want to do more. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's event. First off, Penny Stinson, President of the National Association of Pretrial Services Agencies and CCCN member, will give an opening statement for our network. Judge Stephen S. Alm, First Circuit Court, Honolulu, Hawaii, and innovator of the HOPE program. Dr. Angela Hawken, Professor of Public Policy, New York University. Dr. Doug Marlowe, Chief of Science, Policy, and Law, National Association of Drug Court Professionals, and CCCN member. And closing our network webinar today is Scott Taylor, Director of Multnomah County Department of Community Justice and CCCN at-large member. Now I'd like to turn it over to Penny Stinson.
Hello, everyone. I'm Penny Stinson, President of the National Association of Pretrial Services Agencies and member of the CCCN. It's an honor to be here today, and I thank you all for joining us. Since the early 1980s, we have seen a significant increase in the number of individuals entering the criminal justice system. You may have heard the analogy before about the volume of incarcerated individuals in this country, that the United States is responsible for 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated population. This is truly disturbing. We simply incarcerate far too many people in this country that could be safely supervised in our communities. That is why our network believes it is so critical to identify promising and innovative practices in community corrections and share them with the field. The CCCN believes that individual jurisdictions can adopt the swift and certain philosophy of HOPE while modifying it to fit the unique needs and resources available in local communities. Our network is committed to identifying promising and innovative practices and promoting the use of evidence-based practices. Today, we are here to honor the innovation of the Honorable Judge Stephen Alm and the HOPE strategy. The strategy has demonstrated tremendous success with probation defendants over the past 12 years. In addition to hearing from Judge Alm, our presenters will provide research about the HOPE strategy and evidence-based practices, along with resources for jurisdictions looking for strategies. Again, thank you for joining us today. At this time, I will turn it over to Judge Stephen Alm, who will describe how the HOPE program came about, share some of the successes, challenges, and lessons learned. Judge Alm?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here and share how all this started. And I came up with this original idea for making the probation system work better, but it is truly a story of collaboration. You know, how did a career prosecutor get involved in spending now his career focused on probation? Well, I was assigned to a felony trial calendar in mid-June of '04, and from the beginning, I could see that there were motions to revoke probation where we have smart, dedicated probation officers. They're trying to make it all work. But they were still having some problems, and so I thought, there's got to be a better way to do it. And today, HOPE is, programs inspired by HOPE have been started in 31 states, and whether it's PACE in Alaska, whether it's SAFE for adults or just for juveniles in Arizona, whether it's HOPE in Indiana, this now gives probation administrators, it gives judges, it gives court administrators kind of a go-by of how to get everybody collaborated so they can work together. So let me describe our situation when this all started back in 2004. And before I get further, as a judge, I believe the truly violent and dangerous and the ones who won't stop stealing need to go to prison. They should be sent to prison at sentencing. There's no probation system that's going to work for some people. But I also believe that when we are sending people to prison, we should be sending those who we're afraid of, not who we are mad at. There's too much irritation in the criminal justice system driving decisions. And like I said, I was a career prosecutor. I was 9 years at the Honolulu Prosecutor's Office. The last case I did there was the murder of a police officer. I was then the United States Attorney for 7 years under President Clinton. And then I became a state judge in 2001. And our situation in Hawaii is not that different from many other places. In our jurisdiction here, we have just under 1 million people on Oahu. There are about, when we started this, a little over 8,000 people on felony probation or deferral. The POs had huge caseloads, up to 180 to 1. Our biggest, we all know, alcohol is the biggest problem in court, but the biggest illegal problem is crystal methamphetamine, and then crack cocaine is second. When we started this, we had a drug court, but it was like many drug courts. It was focused on the lower risk pretrial clients, and there were about 100 in there. So let me describe probation as usual. We have well-educated, skilled, dedicated, caring POs, and when I got this idea for HOPE in 2004, our POs, as I learned, had already been using the National Institute of Corrections' 8 evidence-based principles for effective interventions. They were working with the POs, and this included MI, included COG, it included R&R. They were trying all of this, but in spite of that, in spite of these best efforts, they were still having a number of failures on probation. And in the face of a probation violation, they could either work with a person, encourage them using their evidence-based practice, refer them to different resources, or when they felt they were a danger to the community, write up all the violations, bring them back to court, and ask me to send the person to prison for 5, 10, or 20 years. So in spite of everybody's best efforts, probation as usual, and that's what I refer to as PAU, P-A-U, probation as usual, is delayed, it's uncertain, inconsistent, and then when something happens, it's really harsh. So the idea that occurred to me in that first week on the calendar when I would get motions to revoke probation with 10, 15, 20 or more violations, with a recommendation of prison every time. And I thought, if this wouldn't work, what would work better? And I thought, how did my wife and I raise our son, who was then 15? How were we raised? Your parents tell you they care about you, but families have rules, and if we misbehave, if our kid misbehaved, we would do something about it right away. And my guess is that's how most of the people we're talking to today on this webinar were raised. That your parents care about you, but in order for you to learn, they have to do something about it right away. Then whatever sanction they give you doesn't have to be severe, but it has to be swift, it has to be certain, it should be consistent, and the sanction should be proportionate to what went on. So I thought, and this was all being done in a caring, supportive environment, and I thought if we could bring that simple, good parenting concept to the probation system, maybe that could help some of the probationers succeed. And when this came up, I had no idea that 12 years later I'd be talking to the good folks at the CCN network. I'd never heard of Angela Hawken. I had never heard of Mark Kleiman, Daniel Nagin. Folks, I didn't know hardly anything about criminal justice research. I was just trying to respond to a problem in court. And by bringing that swift, certain, and fair, we thought briefly about giving a consequence like community service. But our system is very slow. It takes a long time to get an appointment, assignment. So we decided on jail as our consequence. But as short a time in jail that would help the probationer tie together a behavior with a consequence. And I thought if we could keep the probationers more sober and seeing their probation officer and going to treatment as needed, then those professionals would have a chance to actually work with them. But unless the person's sitting in the chair and is sober, they're never going to get anything done. And so that was the whole idea with it. And I was lucky enough to talk to, at the very beginning, a gifted and innovative probation supervisor, Cheryl Enoy, and I kind of explained what I wanted to do, deconstruct that 20 violation motion to revoke and go back to each and every one when we figured out which conditions of probation this would apply to, and give them a swift, certain, consistent, and proportionate jail sanction. And her response was, "This is great. I absolutely want to do this. This will help bring some accountability to the system." At the same time, she said, "I'm going to have to talk to my POs, and we are going to have to figure out a way how to mesh this sanctions component with what we're currently doing." Because as I say, they were using the NIC's approach. And part of that involved the probation officers developing a working alliance, a therapeutic alliance with their clients. She was wondering, with this jail section, how's that going to work? And happily, she discovered it fits in very well, because if you're talking to a probationer about change, what's going on in their life, making choices, consequences, well, if the PO is talking to a person, they're smoking meth, every once in a while they have problems, it's not quite as concrete. But if they're going to get a few days in jail, it's a little easier to have that conversation. Okay, you used meth and you spent some time in jail. How did that work for you? Did this cause you problems in other parts? And it became an objective matter, not subjective with the PO doing this. But HOPE truly is a collaborative strategy. So it started with Cheryl and I talking about this, and then we brought in the prosecutors, public defender, law enforcement, trying to figure out how to a way to make all of this work. And we brought together all of the parts of the criminal justice system together. And it truly is one of those situations where a crisis can be an opportunity. People were having problems. It wasn't working for many, so we tried to make it work. And that's how we got everybody together to get started. And again, with the idea, if we could keep people sober, seeing their PO, going to treatment, they'd have a better chance to work. And Cheryl Enoy supervised the high-risk probation section. Any sex offender who isn't sent to prison and is put on probation is in her section. The other half of it was made up of people that started on main batch probation but were failing for drug and alcohol reasons and got transferred to her unit. So that's how we, and by then, I had been appointed as the co-chair of the Interagency Council on Intermediate Sanctions. So I started learning about evidence-based principles. I learned that your efforts, you should focus on the high risk. You don't overtreat the low risk, and you don't mix the two groups. Just like, a lot of other programs, prosecutors, public defenders, they put their experienced attorneys on the toughest cases. So the judiciary finally got on board with trying to do the same thing. And so I learned about evidence-based practices. So we started with sex offenders and those most severely addicted to drugs and alcohol. Now the sanctions and the way this works is you treat people like adults, you set up a clear, consistent sanctioning system, and you tell them ahead of time, you're adults, you're going to make your decisions. So here are what the sanctions. So we targeted certain violations at the beginning. Missed appointments, positive drug tests, failure to attend or complete treatment. For sex offenders, it also included any contact with victims, not going to their sex offender treatment and the like. Jail was our only sanction. It's immediate, it's impactful, it's unpleasant. And we laid out, we were going to lay out what the different sanctions would be. If people are late for an appointment, but they test clean, they aren't even arrested. They're given a court date a couple of days later so they can get off work, and we'll lock them up in the cell block at the courthouse. If they ever test positive and admit it, they get arrested on the spot. We have a hearing 2 days later. They get credit for time served. If they test positive and deny it and the lab confirms it, it's 15 days. If they abscond and law enforcement has to look for them, it's 30 days. But we were going to start the whole thing based on a suggestion of the public defender. He said to me, the rules are the same, but you're actually going to enforce them for the first time. Can you warn our guys about that? And I said, okay, that made sense from a fairness and due process standpoint. And since I'm only going to see them for violations, I didn't think it would make my calendar that much busier. And so, based on what the public defenders request, we got everybody organized, talked to the sheriffs, talked to treatment, the head of probation, said, let's get the Attorney General's office keeping statistics on this from day one. And I thought that was fine. But I think he had a misconception at the beginning. He thought this just sounded like punishment. That's never been known to work. So let's get some data to find out whether it really does or not. So on October 1st of 2004,
Cheryl Enoy told us which probationers had been sentenced by my courtroom that were being supervised by her unit. We were trying to remove any questions about cherry picking, get the easier cases, and since we were doing her unit, we figured we were getting the toughest cases. So we had 34 offenders. I had a wanted poster from the U.S. Marshal, and because I used to be the United States Attorney here, the U.S. Marshal agreed to use the fugitive task force to make the arrest, to look for absconders. And I told the assembled group, there were 34 of them, we did 18 sex offenders, 16 drug offenders. And I told them, first, everybody in this courtroom wants you to succeed. Your attorneys do, the probation officer do, the prosecutor does, I do. The taxpayers of Hawaii want you to succeed. It's $46,000 a year to lock people up in prison in Hawaii. But you're adults, you're going to make your own choices. I can't control what you do, but I can control what I'm going to do. So from now on, if there are violations of probation, you're going to do some jail time. If you handle it responsibly, the jail time will be short. If you don't, it'll be longer. But you're going to make these choices. And over the years, I have had so many probationers come up to me and say, Judge, nobody ever told me they wanted me to succeed before. You believed in me from the beginning when nobody else did. And I told them, I hope not to see you again. Go work with your PO. Make good choices. If you want to succeed on probation, you can. And that's what happened. And so we started on October 1st of 2004, and we started to get good results from the beginning. And I think one of that was helped by the fact that HOPE in Hawaii was the Nixon going to China story. I was a career prosecutor. The last case that I did at the prosecutor's office was the murder of a police officer. I had great relations with law enforcement, and I was the toughest sentencer in the building, more consecutive sentences than any of the other judges by far. So I had kind of a reputation that way from the beginning. But we started to see good results from the very beginning with the Attorney Generals. And we started this with no funding, with no press. Everybody just agreed, let's give this a try and see if this will work. But my personal relationships, Cheryl's personal relationships, allowed us to get this collaborative effort from the beginning. It wouldn't work without probation, court staff, law enforcement, both the sheriffs to take people into custody at the courthouse, the U.S. Marshals, Fugitive Task Force to look for absconders, the treatment programs being willing to take people in there, and prosecutors and public defenders willing to have hearings on short notice in order to help folks tie together a behavior with a consequence. The treatment program, and one of the interesting things we really have discovered is for our population, we have methamphetamine users. That's our biggest illegal drug. 60% of the tests are positive for meth. We have discovered that most people in our population can stop using without going to treatment. Dr. Hawken, when she did her randomized control trial study, and she'll talk about that shortly, there were 330 in the study group, 130 in the control group. They were identified for this for this study because they were active drug users. She discovered that 51% of the 330 in the study group did not have a single positive drug test the first year. Another 29% had one. And most of those folks were not in treatment. So if people request treatment, we'll have them go to treatment. Or if they test dirty a couple of times with short jail sanctions, I'm usually saying to them, you know, Mr. Smith, how's that stopping on your own working? And they say, Judge, I guess I got to go to treatment. Then when they go to treatment and the treatment programs give them their assessment tool, whether it's an ASI or an ACES, we have helped cut through denial. They're much more likely to be honest about their drug use. And the treatment programs love this approach because they're only getting people that have requested treatment or have demonstrated they can't stop on their own. So they can use those precious treatment slots for the ones that really need it. And so our goals on the short term were reducing alcohol and drug use and increasing attendance with POs and going to treatment programs. But long term, the idea is to move their motivation from this external pressure to an internal design so they're making a decision their life is better. And if we can keep POs, keep the probationers sober and seeing their probation officer going to treatment and the like, with POs and the treatment programs using evidence-based principles, the defendants have a real chance to succeed on this program. And research is clear. If the probation officer, treatment provider, if they can develop a working alliance with the clients, they have a much better chance to succeed. And similar to the drug court approach, now a HOPE judge forms a similar kind of a working alliance. The probationers know I want them to succeed, and I'm going to hold them accountable, but we're trying to encourage them and have them succeed. So at the same time, HOPE and evidence-based principles work very well together. And there are a number of misconceptions about HOPE, and we'll talk about those, you know, presently. But one of the basic misconceptions is people think, oh, HOPE takes the place of all the good initiatives that probation and parole officers are already doing. Nothing could be further from the truth. Our POs, when HOPE started, were already using the National Institute of Corrections EBP approach. That means assessing folks for risk and need and targeting your resources at the folks that are the higher risk population. Then the PO is trying to use motivational interviewing to talk about change and try to enhance their motivation. And then they're trying to use the R&R approach to find appropriate programs. So for example, if somebody has tried an outpatient program and they've been given the LSIR and that hasn't worked, and the PO decides they need residential treatment, well, we have a number of good drug treatment programs, one of which is located out on the Waianae Coast. It's called Ho'omaukeola. It has a heavy Hawaiian spiritual component. So if we have a Native Hawaiian probationer, that might be a good fit for them rather than one of the other traditional programs. So again, HOPE and evidence-based principles, HOPE works to make all of those work better. It first directly addresses substance abuse, and it does it very well. So the folks in HOPE are going to use drugs a lot less. They're going to drink a lot less. They're going to see their PO more often, and it creates an environment where we've reduced denial, and it lets the POs work. So one of the misunderstood things is people think, oh, HOPE, that's the sanctions program. It's like it has a sanctions component, but the purpose of the sanction is in service to keeping people sober, seeing their PO, going to treatment, so those professionals can work with them and help them succeed. Now, why does HOPE work? Well, we are convinced if the probationers think a system is fair, they're going to invest in it. They know they're on felony probation. They know there are going to be rules for it. Well, now those rules are enforced, but they're enforced in a consistent and proportionate manner. And it's by probation officers and judges who want them to succeed. It's swift, certain, consistent, and proportionate, and it's caring. Now, HOPE has been fortunate to work not only with good POs and good treatment providers, but we have other folks who have come to us who want to work. And a good example of that are Patricia Boone and Leah Jimenez. They are committed and caring women who are trying to help people in probation and in other parts of society to improve their lives, to help them not only to survive, but then to thrive. Now, Leah is going to share with you one of the HOPE probationers that they worked with, whom they appropriately call a hopeful, and share what that probationer thought about her life and where it was going. Leah?
Thank you, Judge Alm. On behalf of Patricia Boone, a compassionate lawyer who is my business partner, and myself, we thank you for the opportunity to share the important voice who is often not heard. In contrast to using labels such as probationer and felon, which are limiting and dehumanizing, as Judge Alm mentioned, we refer to participants of HOPE probation as hopefuls to convey their infinite potential. The following words that I have the privilege to share were written by Carissa Ki'ali'i Nohomoku, a 26-year-old Native Hawaiian hopeful who is working full-time, attending college, and will no doubt change the world. This is a huge opportunity for me and my personal growth because it has given me a chance to explore my inner self. It has been a long time since I have actually dug deep within and got to work on bettering Carissa. I am getting out of my comfort zone and putting myself out there. I am ready and willing to learn all that I can, and this is a great experience for me. I have goals today. The biggest one is helping others. So by giving back, I want to start a movement in which I will be targeting young people first, because I personally feel that is where the problem starts. Young adults and teens often feel alone in this world, and that's where all the curiosity and feelings of wanting to belong take over, and we all know that curiosity can sometimes be trouble. I want to reach out to the young community and let them know they are not alone. They don't have to go through life trying to fit in or be accepted, especially by the wrong crowd. My movement will be a place of safety and tranquility, a safe haven, if you will. I thank you for the wonderful opportunity. You see the best in people, no matter where they've come from or what they've done. You remind me that I am important.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you and Patricia for the work you're doing, both with HOPE probationers and other people that are challenged in our society. Two of the concrete examples I have seen in court that show me that the HOPE probationers think they're being treated fairly is I get almost no requests to change POs anymore, and I have had maybe 30, 31 contested hearings with live witnesses in 12 years of doing HOPE. That's even when folks are going to go to prison because typically they've absconded too often. They know they've been given chances, so they admit it. And one of the stark examples of this, I remember reading in Slate magazine, when Dr. Hawkins came to Hawaii once, she went down to the jail, they let her talk to the HOPE probationers that were doing HOPE sanction. And most of them told her, I'm in because of my bad choice. Maybe I hope we'll do better next time. She said this language of personal responsibility, I think made the hair on her arms stand up. And I thought this really made a lot of sense to me. So, we have started with 34 HOPE probationers on October 1st of 2004, and as I only see the folks in HOPE when they violate, that allows a single judge to supervise a huge number. Up until my recent retirement a month ago, I was supervising 2,000 felony probationers of the 6,800 on Oahu, and that includes anybody convicted of a sex offense. And like I said, now 31 states are using this strategy based on HOPE in probation, parole. We're doing one in pretrial, the 29 in probation, 4 in parole. We're doing a pretrial pilot, and several prison settings, and Dr. Hawkins will talk about this later, are using this kind of a swift, certain, and fair component strategy to reduce the inmate assaults on other inmates and on staff, as well as to reduce their over-reliance on solitary confinement. The Department of Justice is sponsoring new strategies, and HOPE is one of those rare programs that unless somebody has an agenda or doesn't understand HOPE or the probation system, has few natural enemies. But there are some critics, and I think it is, some folks do have agendas, some folks don't understand this, probably the most basic misunderstanding is they think, oh, this is just jail, and it's a formulaic system. They don't get it, that it's a fair system, that what we think is harsh and draconian is people failing at probation and going to prison for 5 years. That's why practitioners hear about this and they think this kind of a strategy of a fair, consistent sanctions model combined with evidence-based principles, all done in a caring environment, is going to make our system work better. Now, I like to say HOPE has destroyed, to me, a number of myths. First, that government can't work effectively, and that systems can't change. Now, this isn't to say this is easy. This is really hard. Change is the hardest thing for people to do. They're used to working in their comfort zone, do what they've always done, but I think it was Einstein who said, you know, the definition of insanity is to continue to do the same thing over and over and expect to get a different result. So the whole, crisis can be an opportunity really applies to this. We've also shown that not everybody needs treatment to stop using drugs and alcohol. Some folks are able to stop on their own. We've discovered with our alcohol and methamphetamine population that most people can stop using without going to treatment. So we're looking forward to seeing how this works in other areas. Other places are trying this with a higher risk population in parole. Other places are doing it with opiates. But at the same time, every single person who can stop using without going to treatment saves a treatment slot for somebody who can't stop on their own, who really needs it, or who volunteers for doing it. You don't have to choose between treatment and jail consequences. Accountability works. And as Cheryl likes to talk about with her POs, jail is not punishment. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose is accountability and have folks learn to tie together bad choices with a consequence. HOPE was also very effective with the mentally ill population. There are clear guidelines, there are clear sanctions, it increases attendance at treatment, it increases attendance at therapy groups, and it increases medication compliance. We have great support from all of our treatment programs in Hawaii, whether that's sex offender treatment, whether it's domestic violence treatment, or the most common is drug and alcohol treatment. And when I started this, people told me, you know, this kind of idea is never going to work. A few days in jail, that's never going to work with people that have gone to prison or who have, you know, done months in jail, and because they can do time standing on their head. And I said, yeah, they can do time when they have to, but human nature being what it is, they don't want to do it today. It's the disruptive nature of this that helps people make better choices. Now, again, there are a number of cautions. HOPE sounds easy. It is not, particularly to do it right. You've got to figure out a way to make the HOPE sanctions component mesh or work with your existing system, and some places have had problems with that. This takes shared leadership between a judge and a probation supervisor. And for a lot of judges, you know, we are trained, we're paid to make decisions. We're trained not to be second-guessing ourselves. But a program like this needs shared leadership, and that means both the judge and the PO have to be willing to take a phone call from the other. And you all know, I mean, the judge has to be willing to take a phone call from the PO soup when he or she is not following the model, when they're not giving an appropriate sanction. And it really does turn the probation system upside down because they have to move quickly right away with it, and they have to figure out a way to make it work. The judge's calendar is going to get busier too. Getting the sanctions piece right is critical. I think the most common stumble here is people not differentiating between somebody taking responsibility, say for drug use and getting a couple days in jail, and people that abscond. And we made it 30 days in jail. We don't want to give them the 30 days. We want to deter them from doing that so they do take responsibility. And so that's what we're trying to do. HOPE needs a champion. A judge is a natural example of that. It could be a probation supervisor, but a judge has to be on board with this at the same time. And occasionally it's somebody else, but it's got to be somebody respected by the whole system to do it. Change is hard. A lot of folks are going to resist change, but sometimes you just have to power through and do something new. Now, I also had the privilege of becoming the drug court judge. And talking to Cheryl Enoy and talking to the drug court administrator, we made a conscious effort to shift the focus of our drug court, our target population, from a lower risk pretrial operation where the prosecutors have a total veto over who goes into drug court to a high risk probation operation. So basically, think of a courthouse as a hospital. Probation as usual is the outpatient clinic. HOPE is the hospital wards. You've got serious problems going on. But if folks can't make it there, they need to go into the ICUs. Drug court should be your intensive care unit. We started taking people with violent histories into drug court because, again, they're going to be on community supervision. A judge has already made that call. So why not watch them closely in drug court where you have wraparound services? Drug court is the best way to supervise people on probation, but it is labor intensive. We increased our drug court from 127 to 197, including a component where 60 people ended up who were in a dual diagnosis situation, and that has turned out to be very successful. And that's so our continuum now is probation as usual for many, HOPE for the ones who need more, who need a consequence, plus the EBPs, and then drug court for the most severely addicted. We do have folks who are severely addicted in HOPE, but even if our drug court is doing the best it can, that's only 200 people. I supervise 2,000 in HOPE. I wish we could have a drug court that was twice as big. So finally, you know, some ongoing developments. When Dr. Hawken did her research, she discovered all 10 felony judges who were doing this at the time. We have since come back to one judge doing the bulk. I had 2,000, another judge had 300, but we got the same results with all the judges. There's no operator effect. We had early morning drug testing for those who wanted to come in at 6:30 in the morning, who had paycheck jobs or school, you know, weekend jail sanctions when that's appropriate. We have gotten more than $1 million from the legislature for the past 11 years. We use 3/4 of it for drug treatment. because some people can stop on their own, but many cannot, and that means going to treatment. And by reserving it for a smaller number, you can provide quality treatment. You can provide residential treatment for many. You can provide intensive outpatient. We're doing a pretrial pilot, and last year, Ms. Inoy and I, along with Dr. Robert DuPont from DC and his IBH team, wrote the state-of-the-art of HOPE probation. So if you want to see what the horse's mouth says about HOPE, don't look at what somebody else has written about it, because they may get it wrong in many cases. Look at the state-of-the-art of HOPE probation is a good go-by and a good thing for people to understand. This is what it really is. And number one of our essential elements, of course, is shared leadership between a judge and a PO. Number two is how to mesh this system with your existing system. Now, while HOPE has been, the idea has been picked up in a number of states, and this has also inspired the Swift, Certain, and Fair Center. Dr. Hawkins, who has been the chief researcher here, is head of that, and I'm going to turn it over to her now to talk about both the results in Hawaii and the spread across the country.
Thank you, Judge Arm, and thank you to CCCN for facilitating what we hope will be an ongoing conversation about corrections reform. 7 million individuals adults in the United States are supervised by some correctional authority, and a sizable share of those individuals are drug involved, which means probation and parole departments across the country are really put on the front lines of solving drug use challenges in the country. Every year, the Bureau of Justice Statistics releases results on how successful folks are of completing the terms of their supervision, and if you look at historical trend data, the percentage who do manage to successfully complete has only improved very modestly over time. This is in spite of many well-intended efforts at reform to improve outcomes for individuals under supervision. I think the challenge of those results is that we really have no choice but to think creatively and to think in new and innovative ways about how to improve the outcomes of those individuals under supervision. The results of many probation and parole programs not able to help those individuals successfully complete is that many judges and prosecutors are unlikely to recommend the use of community supervision as an alternative to prison, because they often just don't have enough faith in community corrections as a meaningful alternative to prison. So the onus really is on us and all of those in the field to really find new creative ways to try to help people succeed. We see the management problem as follows. We have many phenomenal probation and parole agents across the country. I meet them all the time. But they have many challenges that they face, in particular large caseloads. They have very many people under their supervision. They have limited supervision resources. They have limited drug treatment resources, and often long lists of technical of conditions of supervision. For those of you who have read conditions of probation and parole, you know that often you have to be a lawyer just to understand them. The rules are unclear, and many violations go undetected because we'll never have the monitoring capacity to actually monitor all of those conditions we've told people that they may or may not do. So many rules are unclear, many violations go undetected, and it sends a message to probationers and parolees that the probability of a response is really low. That gets made worse when, even if the violation is detected, many of those violations are not responded to. In many cases, we find they aren't even recorded. That sends a message also that reinforces the message that the probability of a response is even lower. And what we see is long strings of accumulated violations that aren't responded to, which sends a message that violating is okay. And then in many cases, if a violation is detected and it is recorded and a response is made, that response is very low. In some jurisdictions, the response kicks in many, many weeks, sometimes months after the violation. And that then makes the response seem arbitrary and unfair. I'm being violated because you're in a bad mood rather than something I did. So it doesn't help to tie the behavior to the consequence. So Swift, Certain, Fair is really a response to that challenge. How do we get supervision agencies to respond in a quicker way? How do we have more predictable responses, so swift and certain responses to violations? And how do we ensure that the violations that are being responded to are addressed in an equitable fashion, are fair? And I think at this time, especially when criminal justice agencies are really managing serious problems of legitimacy, looking for approaches that can shrink race, ethnic gaps in violation responses is something that has to be paid attention to. And certainly the early data from from swift, certain, fair implementations across the country are starting to indicate that this might be a strategy because of its relatively formulaic response to shrink that gap in race ethnic disparity, which really sends a signal that we have an opportunity to, and because that sanction is a decision point, and providing opportunities to shrink the gap at those decision points is really important and really makes us more inclined to try to understand this approach in more detail. We think close monitoring, swift responses, and modest sanctions are also essential for procedural justice, and sending a message to individuals who are under supervision that we are creating a system that responds fairly to their violating behavior. As Judge Alm just mentioned, HOPE is a particular strategy within a class of programs called the Swift, Certain, Fair, under this umbrella of the Swift, Certain, Fair approach, or Swift, Certain, Fair model. What we tend to see is that most of these approaches start with clearly articulated rules. Increasingly, as we're working with states across the country on implementing these sorts of approaches, we're really encouraging rationalizing those rules. So having shorter lists of rules that really are central to the criminal behavior to begin with. We're very interested in seeing models that have credible responses, and that means, can the probation and the parolee rely on your word? Are you doing what you're telling them you're going to do? We like models that start with a formal orientation. Judge Alm calls it his sworn-in hearing. Other states refer to an orientation hearing. The idea here is that the person is put on notice very clearly what the rules of engagement are. This also creates an opportunity, which we think is central to the model, for sending the message of goodwill, that everybody here is working together to help the person succeed. We already are concerned about implementations where that goodwill is not put central to the model. The atmosphere within which this sort of approach is implemented is central to the success. Every probationer needs to know that they are being listened to, cared for, and that everybody is rallying around them to help them succeed in the community. Under the model, supervision conditions are closely monitored and they're actually enforced, which for many probation departments is a marked departure from business as usual, and in some cases is a challenge for implementation. For those individuals where there's a nexus between drug use and criminal behavior, there's regular random drug testing as appropriate. And all of those violations are met with an immediate, modest consequence. Now, what the consequence is varying substantially from implementation to implementation, and I'll talk a little bit later about some of the most recent innovation in the field where non-incarcerating responses are being delivered. Also, very importantly, we're starting to learn in important ways about integrating incentives and rewards into the approach, using rewards to reinforce compliance, and I'll talk a little bit later also about states that are really on the front lines of finding creative ways to motivate good behavior on supervision. So what is the evidence behind Swift, Certain, Fair? I think the fairest assessment is to say this is a promising strategy, but we still have a great deal to learn. So with some humility, we need to look around the country and learn about the circumstances under which this approach can show promise and circumstances under which this is probably not a good strategy to be attempted. One thing Judge Alm mentioned earlier is that in his courts, the idea is to put people into custody he is scared of, not people he is mad at. And we do see many jurisdictions where there is an instinctive response to put people into custody. Without a court that has the philosophy of working with individuals on supervision, even if that means multiple bites of the apple, if public safety is not a concern, we really want to see judges collaborating with probation to work with people and keep them in the community rather than trigger a revocation to prison. There have been several evaluations of HOPE-style strategies. The first started in 2007 with a randomized control trial right here in Hawaii that involved dozens of criminal justice officials, judges, probation officers, and the public defenders. Has been very influential in the creation and ongoing developments in Hawaii, the prosecutor's office, and very importantly and often neglected in discussions around this sort of strategy is the role of the drug treatment providers. Hawaii has a very fortunate position of an amazing drug treatment coalition. There is phenomenal opportunities for care here, including long-term residential care for those people who need it. And the treatment providers have really been central to what we think is a very important part of the success of the implementation here in Hawaii. There have been many implementations and evaluations in other jurisdictions, all of varying quality. And we've seen various degrees of implementation fidelity to the principles of swiftness, certainty, and fairness. The HOPE randomized control trial in Hawaii that started in 2007 took essentially 500 high-risk individuals in Honolulu and allocated them either to Judge Arm's HOPE supervision, which at the time was overseen by 10 judges, or to a control group that was supervised under probation as usual. For those who were assigned to HOPE, they were much more likely to show up for their probation appointments, more than twice as likely to show up. They were also much less likely to test positive for illicit drug use. They were less than half as likely to be revoked and returned to prison. And I think for many people, why the approach was paid attention to was that in Honolulu, in their local implementation, there was a substantial reduction in days in custody that followed the implementation of HOPE. Judge Arm mentioned in his presentation what we refer to as the behavioral triage model, and this shows how many times a probationer tested positive for illegal drugs in their first year of exposure to HOPE. And as we can, and just a reminder here, everybody was screened into this program by virtue of demonstrating that they were drug involved, and most of them were really considered as seriously drug involved. But after being put into this model that already had a reputation, the program was 3 years old, probationers understood that the bench meant what it said, that the conditions of probation would be responded to. Over half of them never tested positive in the 1-year follow-up period. And what's important here is that they were all subjected to regular random drug testing, up to 6 times a month for those who needed it, with a step down if they were testing negative. Only a small minority, it was only about 10%, tested positive 3 or more times. What's very important and often not known about HOPE is that anybody who raises their hand and says they would like a treatment referral is given that treatment referral. After that, so in that way, it really becomes a person-centered approach to treatment. They get to say what they need and are assigned that way. Otherwise, they're told, well, if you can demonstrate to us that you are able to desist from drug use, you will not be mandated to treatment by the court. You'll be given the opportunity to prove to us that you are able to desist from drug use. Those who show through their behavior that they are not able to modify their drug use are then mandated to treatment through the courts. But because not everybody is assigned to drug treatment, the treatment slots are reserved for those people who show that they need it. The result is those who are referred to treatment are given outstanding quality care. It's not unusual to see the court refer someone to 6 months, 9 months, even a year of high-quality residential treatment. And those sorts of referrals would not have been possible if everybody was given a little bit of nothing. We've just completed a 7-year follow-up evaluation of that initial randomized controlled trial in Hawaii. Now, just as a reminder to interpret these results, that supervision terms in Hawaii are quite long, typically 4 years or 5 years, so individuals are exposed to HOPE for relatively long periods of time. At the 7-year follow-up, we found 50% reduction in follow-up drug charges. So that is, they were on HOPE, exposed to HOPE with monitoring of their drug use for an extensive period of time, and that behavior that reduced drug use, that period seems protective because they continued to have reduced drug use all the way out to 7 years. There were small changes in other charges, which raises interesting questions about the nexus between drug use and crime. There was a 50% reduction in returns to prison, and very importantly, a new initiative that Judge Arm implemented after we had started the randomized control trial was to introduce his first incentive into the model. We now see other states that have gotten really creative on the use of incentives and rewards, but the most meaningful reward that Judge Arm offers in his courtroom is the opportunity for early termination if individuals are otherwise performing well. He tells them in open court on the first day, if you show to me good behavior for 2 years, I'll cut you loose of what would otherwise have been a 4 or 5 year supervision term. We tracked the first 100 of those early terminations and found that not a single one of them had a new criminal justice encounter. Judge Arm was speaking with us earlier today and saying, of all the terminations he now does, and there are many of them, they do many early terminations now, they only know of one that has had to return to court. In other words, those individuals that have indicated that they're a good bet, that they can be moved safely off of the supervision caseload, allowing probation officers to focus on those individuals who are experiencing more challenges. But really important, and this is where I think we're going to learn more about implementation here as well as in other parts of the country, was that there was no difference in terms of by race ethnicity for implementation or outcomes. And again, the opportunity to find relatively formulaic responses that shrink those decision points, that really impose more equity in the system, is something we want to pay attention to. Swift, Certain, Fair has now expanded to many other parts of the country and has many different sorts of implementation. We saw an implementation for high-risk parolees in Seattle. There are now juvenile implementations, pre-trial implementation here in Hawaii. There's a randomized controlled trial underway where the research team is out of Berkeley looking at pre-trial version of this. And very importantly, we're now seeing in-custody implementations. In fact, many people are now assuming that the model actually is much more easy to implement in in-custody settings. We see Ohio, Washington State, and Pennsylvania that have integrated the ideas of swiftness, certainty, and fairness into prison reform, and the goal there is to reduce the use of solitary confinement. Last week, the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections released their results of their pilots that have showed sizable reductions in violating behavior and sizable reductions in referrals to solitary confinement following their implementation in January this year. We now see the model implemented in at least 30 states, and we saw the first tribal implementation with the Lummi Nation. There's now also statewide rollouts. Washington implemented Swift and Certain in Washington State and have their own evaluation out by Washington State University. We also are seeing the beginnings of a statewide rollout in Alaska. And Michigan now has so many HOPE courts that we can essentially consider that a statewide rollout, and they also have their own evaluation attached to that. There's been substantial interest now from federal probation, and we're also seeing international interest in this set of principles. But there are many issues regarding generalizability, and we have to take pause and learn from what we're learning from across the country. There are many differences in what implementation will look like and what likely results would be based on agency designs, the relationship between the probation department, for example, and the courts. This is much easier to implement when probation is a function of the judiciary and harder to do in other sorts of circumstances. We also need to know a lot more about business as usual. In certain circumstances, if you have a model that includes a jail response, you will add jail time if business as usual never results in jail stays. We really have to learn a lot more about local circumstances and the local environment where this implementation will take place to know whether or not this is an approach that will likely result in reductions in incarceration. The U.S. Department of Justice has supported the idea of swiftness, certainty, and fairness in several ways. They funded the National Demonstration Experiment, which involves randomized controlled trials in Arkansas, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Texas. Those involved an outright replication of the original version of HOPE that Judge Arm designed in 2004. We'll learn a lot from that experiment about the importance of local circumstances, and we'll also know a lot more about how important it is to have what we call organic design. HOPE was designed in Hawaii by Hawaiians for the challenges of their caseload, which at the time is and still continues to be a primarily methamphetamine-using population. So we're going to learn a lot more about the essentials of local design and adjusting to local circumstances. In 2014, the Bureau of Justice Assistance awarded 7 jurisdictions awards to assist with program costs for implementing this sort of approach. In 2015, they made 5 awards, and we're about to learn about the 2016 awards for new jurisdictions who will weave the principles of swiftness, certainty, and fairness into their own implementations. The Bureau of Justice Assistance also funded the Swift, Certain, Fair Resource Center, which is now functioning out of New York University. Everything provided by the Resource Center is at no cost to implementing jurisdictions, and also through the Resource Center we're able to point individual agencies to the resources available through BJA. There's a number of opportunities for both technical assistance but also programming support to implement this sort of strategy. Increasingly also, BJA is integrating principles of swiftness, certainty, and fairness in the work that they do through the Violence Reduction Network. In terms of general observations and outlooks, I think the truth is we are many unknowns, and I think for those of us who are curious and hopeful for this field, we are all willing to innovate and test new strategies as they're coming along. I want to make a few points here. The first is, please keep an eye on Ohio. Ohio is the state that it's really quite creative at this point in terms of working with the model and testing new strategies. We don't yet know whether a jail sanction is the only sanction that can shape behavior or whether states can experiment with alternatives to incarceration. If the pilots underway in Ohio demonstrate that you can have a behavioral response without the use of incarceration, this model will be applicable in many additional circumstances. We're also learning more about integrating rewards into the model. New York is the state to watch in this regard. The RESET model in New York has taken the ideas of swiftness, certainty, and fairness and integrated them into a comprehensive reform of parole. The idea there is to really make this a more individual-based response. It's person-centered, it's place-based supervision, and there's a sizable and a swift and certain response for individuals who are doing well. And very importantly, under the banner of swift, certain, fair, the swift is clear. We just reconfigure our systems to move more quickly. The certainty is clear. What we want to do is make sure that we have predictable and proportionate responses in response to individuals either violating or doing well. The F is more of a challenge. HOPE was designed in Hawaii for Hawaii by Hawaiians and was a model. If we think about our discussions with probation officers and our interviews with probationers, they constantly use the language of fair, that the fairness was based on the system in Hawaii. But to think about how fairness translates into other jurisdictions, what is fair in place A, given local circumstances, might be considered less fair in place B that has an entire different set of philosophies and different set of circumstances. So there's a lot of hard work to be done and a conversation to be had around the issue of fairness and how do we implement this and make sure that what we're doing is perceived as fair and that everybody has standing in the discussion of fairness. That's judges and probation officers, but equally important, the people they are serving have to be at the table in the discussion of fairness. For those of you who are interested in learning more about what resources are available, the Swift, Certain, Fair Resource Center, svfcenter.org, details everything out there that we can gather from across the country, including descriptions of implementation, research coming to bear, resources available for jurisdictions interested in learning more. BJA has a specific solicitation out every year to support sites directly in a Swift, Certain, Fair implementation. There's also resources available through the NTTAC mechanism, through the Second Chance Act, and even JRI now. So there are plenty of opportunities to learn more about the approach and to think about how the principles of swiftness, certainty, and fairness can be integrated into your systems, and then very important, to evaluate to make sure that this is a model that works for you. I'm going to point you also to some additional resources that NCCC is going to make available on the website to learn more about the implementation of HOPE, specifically the HOPE strategy as implemented in Hawaii, including the document that Judge Alm referred to in terms of the state of the art of HOPE probation. I'm now going to hand over to Doug Marlowe, who's going to talk more and provide a perspective from the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Angela. It is a great pleasure to be here in beautiful Hawaii, honoring the work of Judge Stephen Alm, Dr. Hawken, and their colleagues who have done what is unfortunately relatively rare in the criminal justice system. They saw a problem with probation as usual. They came up with an hypothesis rooted in logic, common sense, their own personal observations, and in fact what we know from behavioral science. They implemented it, and then most importantly, they tested it using powerful experimental methods, randomized controlled trials, followed participants for 7 years, and that is why their intervention has and deserves such legs nationally. My job is to take the 30,000-foot view and see what an evidence-based criminal justice system would look like. Where does HOPE fit in a continuum of interventions? How do we decide who goes to HOPE, who doesn't? How do we get them there? And how do we move people from program to program based on their needs and response to treatment? Now, we have a wide range of interventions available to us in the justice system. We can decriminalize offenses. We can divert people on a pre-plea basis into treatment in lieu of justice processing. We can have people complete some conditions of supervision and then have a felony charge reduced to a misdemeanor conviction. We can take a plea and hold it in abeyance, and if they do well, we can withdraw the plea retroactively. We can sentence to probation or community supervision. We can sentence to restrictive intermediate punishment like community halfway houses, or we can sentence to incarceration. As we move from left to right on this continuum, the cost of these interventions to taxpayers go up exponentially. However, the short-term incarceration risks to public safety, the short-term incapacitation risks go down as people are under the supervision of the more intensive programming, and the effects on the individuals themselves follows what we call a curvilinear function, where the best effects are in the center of the spectrum for programs like HOPE that merge treatment and supervision in the community and reduce excessive reliance on incarceration, but also avoid excessive leniency. HOPE began primarily as a probation, community corrections program. Drug courts that I work in have tended to focus on the pre-plea or post-plea diversion part of the spectrum, but it does not have to be that way. That was an accident, historical accident of how these programs were founded. We are now looking at the effects of HOPE on parole populations. People are looking at the effects of HOPE on reentry programming. That's called the 24/7 Sobriety Project. We are looking at the effects of treatment courts, drug courts, also at the probation level and also at the reentry level. The question is, how do we decide who goes where? How do we get the most effective evidence-based justice system that avoids excessive costs and gets the best effects at the least risk to public safety? Risk needs responsivity theory tells us that we must first match people to interventions based on their risk. We are not talking here about a risk necessarily for violence or dangerousness. As Judge Alden said, some people are a risk to community safety and they need to be incapacitated, but risk in this context means a poorer prognosis or a highly likelihood of failing on traditional probation or a traditional referral to treatment, the likelihood of continuing in the behavior they were engaged in before. The higher the risk level, the more intensive the supervision and the accountability should be, and vice versa. If you overprogram low-risk individuals, you will actually make them worse. And never, ever, ever mix high-risk and low-risk people together, because risk is very contagious, and low-risk people become high-risk people when they interact too much with high-risk people. The need principle focuses on the syndromes, disorders, dysfunctions that many individuals in the justice system have. We want to focus our efforts on the needs that cause crime. We call them criminogenic needs, or that interfere with correctional rehabilitation. They're sometimes called stabilizers or responsivity needs. We focus a lot on addiction and mental illness because they are the most common and most severe criminogenic and responsivity needs in the system. The higher the need level, the more intensive the treatment, and vice versa. As Judge Alm and Dr. Hawken indicated, many people do not require treatment, and giving treatment to people who don't require them not only wastes resources, but actually makes people worse. And again, never, ever, ever mix low need and high need people together, because need, like risk, is highly contagious. The risk and needs matrix tells us that if what we should do depends on both risk and need, then we have some people who are both high risk and high need. They may be seriously addicted, seriously mentally ill, and have high risk factors for failure on probation or supervision. Some people may be low risk and low need and have neither of those characteristics, and you see the permutation. What research tells us is that what you must do for individuals in one of those quadrants will be a waste of time, a waste of resources, and potentially damaging to somebody in another quadrant. For individuals who are both high risk and high need, they need a combination of both the close monitoring, the fair, consistent, certain consequences, and they also need treatment services, and this is what the drug court or treatment court model was developed for. It was developed for people who will not get better without both treatment and a supervision accountability regimen. If somebody can get better in a regimen that's primarily supervision and accountability, they should not be in a treatment court. Some individuals are high risk, but their needs may be relatively lower. The emphasis would be on accountability, and an example, HOPE would be a potential example, although as you heard previously, HOPE is actually, although caricatured as a purely accountability court, actually provides a great deal of services focusing on procedural fairness and matching people, and so HOPE is actually more than it has sometimes been indicated. Individuals who are very high need, seriously addicted, mentally ill, but low risk from a criminal justice perspective are the ones that ought to be diverted into treatment programming and let the criminal justice system simply keep an eye on making sure that they're where they need to be and going where they need to be, and basically stay out of it as long as treatment has its chance to intervene. And finally, individuals who are low risk and low need, the best thing we can do for them is to leave them alone and divert them out after a banked period of probation and get them out of the system before they are exposed to higher risk and higher need individuals. The responsivity part of risk-need responsivity tells us that the no treatment can possibly be evidence-based unless it is matched to the risk and need profile of the individual. Deciding how to decide where somebody goes, there are a number of ways we could do that. Dr. Hawken and Judge Alm have spoken of behavioral triage, which says let the behavior of the individual let you know whether they need to be moved from, say, a HOPE court to a drug court program. That has the advantage of not requiring a lot of expenditures on assessments up front. Assessments also have some questions about validity and reliability when you're relying on the reports of individuals in the justice system, and it basically focuses on objective measures. Risk and need assessment, more traditional approach, is to decide who goes where based on an assessment of both risk and need so that we don't wait until they have to perform poorly in one program before going into another one, but they are more expensive to engage in risk-need assessment. Adaptive programming is a third approach, which basically combines both. It says that we do a risk-need assessment. We say, you go to HOPE, this person goes to drug court, this other person is diverted into treatment, but then we watch them closely, and based on how they perform, we let their behavior tell us whether they got the right assignment or whether they need to be moved. Of course, we need programs to match them too. If a jurisdiction says we have drug court and that's all we have, then it really doesn't matter what the risk-need level of the person is because they're going to drug court. And they will get, in many respects, treatment they don't need, and that, as we said, will waste resources and make them worse. If a program only has HOPE, then individuals who require the highest level, the ICU model of treatment, as Judge Alm indicated, will not have that necessarily available to them, and so jurisdictions need to have a continuum of interventions. The Annals of Research and Knowledge, the ARC, is a project being developed that identifies effective programming at every stage in the system, from police encounter through reentry, saying what programs work for high risk, high need, low risk, low need, and all the other permutations. And the Community Corrections Collaborative Network, the CCCN, has developed a set of consensus principles which basically say that jurisdictions have a responsibility to have the full continuum of interventions available to meet the needs of the individuals coming into their system, to do the appropriate assessment either through behavioral triage or risk-need assessment, get people into the right interventions, continue to match them to appropriate services, and hold them accountable for not only complying with court conditions, but holding them accountable for going to the treatment services they need if they in fact need those services. I am going to stop there and pass the baton to my distinguished colleague, Scott Taylor from Multnomah County. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. It's been a real honor to be part of the CCCN, and particularly this meeting where we had the opportunity to dive deep with Judge Alm, Angela, and Doug, and we hope that as I finish this, you'll have the opportunity and questions to dive to your own depth. There's a few things we wanted to make sure we covered. Some of the challenges as we've looked at all this. We want to make sure that we are clear. It's been said by each of the presenters that every system is different. Every system is at a current place of stasis, and as we move forward, you have to look at your operation, what goes on in your place, and what that culture looks like. And we all have to be real that culture eats initiatives for breakfast. So if you're not ready to change, if you can't have those conversations, and we mean collaborative conversations. One of the things that's been clear talking to our experts is that those places where true collaboration has taken place, move forward faster, and the results are better, and the fidelity and the implementation. And so we need to consider that all the time as we work with each other in this system. It is not a one-shop operation. The other thing we want to talk about is the resource shift as you build basics. So as you go through this and you look at what Judge Alm gave us with the overall structure of HOPE, and then you listen to Angela and Doug about what modifications, what additional learning we've had, you may find that you have to actually begin to move some of your resources. That can be staff, that can be contracts, that can be overall the way you do business. We also run into the idea of political resistance. And as Angela talked about swift and certain and proportionate, that's a great example of what we are now facing as a myth-busting opportunity to talk about what the science shows, what the impact is, and how the length of stay may not be related at all to the effectiveness in trying to change someone's behavior. So we're going to continue to dive on that and see what we can learn over time. There have been some exciting developments in that conversation. As was mentioned, not one model fits. There may be opportunities for you to be even swifter and more certain, and that is a collaborative discussion locally on what resources and what statutes and opportunities you have. We have staff. There will be staff resistance because we all are skeptical and critical in this field, and we have the idea that something new and shiny may not be better. So you can expect that we will all resist some new program, and that's why any conversation around that has to be tied to the idea that it is something that's actually going to enhance the way we do business today, and that that's new learning. And then it requires a resource awareness and capacity. So sometimes when we go through these opportunities, we fail to anticipate that we're going to need more of something else or a movement from something we're doing today to something else. We've just finished an assessment in my county, for example, that shows we may be over-resourced on alcohol and drug treatment, and we need to build housing and capacity. And I think each of you will have that opportunity as you look at these closer. We just put together a few ideas on what kind of basic toolbox you need to make sure you're looking at, and if you listen to Angela and Doug and everybody, you would see that we need to have a risk tool, criminal needs assessment, the capacity for addressing stability needs, things like housing, employment, those sorts of things, a swift and certain and now proportionate response capacity. Are you able to actually respond swiftly and certainly, and what would that look like? What would you have to change locally? And the fidelity to your model and clarity, when we look at the reviews of the HOPE Court all around the nation, we see that the ability to do what you said you were going to do it and do it with clarity is critical to having a successful shift. And then important to have a data reporting system for tracking the key elements and actually doing adjustment as you move forward to see if you are getting what you thought you were going to get, and if not, what you could change. And with that, we're going to move to questions. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Judge Alm. Thank you, Dr. Hawken and Dr. Marlowe. At this point, we're going to move to the Q&A section of our live event. I have a few questions in front of me that we'll start with for our panelists. The first one I want to throw at Judge Alm. Judge, how do jurisdictions give up judicial discretion and empower probation?
Well, this is a real challenge for judges. As I said, we're paid for and we're trained to be decisive, to make decisions, to be consistent, to stick with what we're doing. And I come at this from a career prosecutor and being a tough senator, but if the decision is made to, not to send somebody to prison, you're going to put them on probation, then the way the judge acts, I think, is going to be critical. And just like probation officers, to make a system fair, it has to be consistent. My whole view of discretion has changed in the last 12 years. Because even though we know judges are thinking through things carefully, probation officers are too, from the probationer standpoint, this is arbitrary. They're treated differently. And so having the consistent approach, and that means for judges, in HOPE, it means giving a sanction every time, but as short as possible to tie together the behavior, the consequence. It's easy to send people to prison. What's harder is trying to work with them. And the whole purpose of HOPE is if judges are consistent, the defendants will think and proportionate, the probation officers will realize they're being treated fairly, it's their choices, they're going to have consequences, and that allows them to work with the probation officers. And the probation officers are going to be empowered by this kind of an approach because they're going to be listened to, they're going to be respected more by the POs. But part of the challenge is judges being willing to get it that in order for the folks to feel like they're being treated consistently, judges have to be consistent.
Thank you, Judge. I have one for Angela. Dr. Hawken, how much time should jurisdictions give themselves when implementing a new program in order to show success?
Well, the first thing I think we need to do is not rush to trying to count success. First of all, get it right. As we heard in the last presentation from Scott, is that I think what you really want to do is think about how long a shakedown period do you need. Our recommendations to most jurisdictions is to start at a really small scale so that it's easy to move the ship. We encourage a period of at least 6 months of just testing with a relatively small caseload to shake things loose, making sure that you are able to get the treatment referrals in place when they're needed, that law enforcement is there to serve the warrants quickly if someone's decided to abscond, and to make sure that you're seeing the right behavioral response. When you're doing this at a small scale, it's easy to make iterative modifications to make sure the implementation is working for you, so that at the 6-month mark you can decide, well, either things are looking good, let's keep what we have, or if this, there's opportunities for tweaking, or maybe this isn't the right model for our jurisdiction, let's try something else. So at small scale, you give yourself an opportunity to figure out if the implementation is right, and at that point you want to start your evaluation.
Thank you, Dr. Hawken. And this may be handled by Dr. Hawken or Judge Alm. Do you know when the pretrial pilot data will be available, and is there any more literature on that?
It'll be available next year. It was a 2-year program to initiate people in the program. So that went from September 1st of 2014 to September 1st of 2016. So nobody new is being enrolled into the randomized control trial study, but the ones who are enrolled now need to process through the system. So it's pre-trial, it's going to be shorter than probation, but I would anticipate it's next year. Steve Raphael, the criminologist from Berkeley, is doing the randomized control trial study, and it's funded by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. So we're all very interested to see how it goes. One of the interesting parts of the pre-trial pilot is part of the programming involved money for treatment, both outpatient and residential, in the pretrial area, which was very exciting.
Thank you, Judge. We have one for Dr. Marlowe here. What can you do if you don't have a researcher on staff? How do you measure success?
So there are a number of performance indicators that programs can keep on their own services in their program very simply, that are known to be very powerful predictors of successful outcomes. These would, for example, would include attendance rates at scheduled counseling appointments, proportions of drug-negative urine samples, how many units of service participants receive, and whether or not they graduate from the program. So graduation rate, attendance rate, clean drug test rate, and length of stay, how long they stay. If you can measure those essentially 4 or 5 variables, you have a pretty good understanding of the likely effects on recidivism. Now, you can't prove what your effects on recidivism are, but this is the kind of stuff that you can show that you are meeting the standards for short-term effects in the program. Chances are you're going to get long-term effects.
Thank you, Doctor. Go ahead.
I just want to make a follow-up comment. Thank you, Doug. The Department of Justice has been really quite good in terms of providing resources to any jurisdiction that's interested in weaving the ideas of swiftness, certainty, and fairness into their own practice. There are specific RFPs that come out every year looking for ways to support those programs, both on the program implementation side as well as the evaluation side. There's also opportunities for technical assistance on the research side through the NT-TAC mechanism. So if you refer to the Swift, Fair, and Fair resource site, there are lots of opportunities there to be provided support not only on implementation but also in terms of research and evaluation.
Thank you, Dr. Hawken. Judge Alm, I want to, we've talked a little bit about the resources, and before you started the HOPE program, it was about 180 to 1. And one of the questions that came in is, like, how do you staff cases for court, and who comes to court?
Okay, well, one of the changes from this is Probation officers will prepare a template violation report, send it to the court along with a motion to modify or revoke. Copies of that are given to the attorneys, so then the probation officers don't come to court anymore. They're not there for these hearings. And part of the reason is they're busy. They need to meet with clients, and the bigger your program gets, the more critical that becomes. And I think in some ways it can backfire. If you have the probation officer there, the tendency is to ask them questions and try to delve into different parts of the person's background. And what we try to, in HOPE, we try to keep it focused on what is the instant behavior? What are we looking at now? Somebody tested positive, admitted to it, they got arrested, they're going to get 2 days in jail. It doesn't matter what their history was or otherwise. We're basically looking at that. And this is one of the differences between HOPE and drug court. We don't staff these ahead of time. We don't bring people to talk about it. I had a prosecutor once ask me, you know, is my role, am I in a treatment team or am I an advocate? In HOPE, you're an advocate. And, you know, the motion is there. Now, the fact is, in almost all, you know, most of the cases, the person is going to admit to the violation. As I said, I've had maybe 30 contested hearings in 12 years, even when people are going to prison. But that's because they've been treated fairly, they've been given chances. So the probation officers are certainly available. The prosecutor, public defender can call them up and discuss it. But unless there's a contested hearing, they don't have to come to court.
Okay, and I think you touched on this a little earlier, Judge, but I wanted you to kind of clarify. Why do cases only come to court for violations, or is there progress hearings?
Typically, it's only for violations. And part of that is the probation officers are busy. And normally, you know, when HOPE is not available, often judges will set numerous progress hearings, review hearings, because of course they're curious to know how is the person doing. But when that's in place, the probation officer either has to be there or prepare a report or both. So every once in a while, the probation officer in HOPE will request a review hearing. Or if I'm letting somebody out of jail in order to follow up with some procedure, I may set a review hearing, but that's the exception. Normally, there are not progress reports. You know, they're going to work with the PO, they're going to keep doing it, they're going to go to treatment. If they have a problem, they're going to come back to court. So this is a very lean program. I only see them for violations. Dr. Hawkins' research found the average hearing is 7 minutes long. And mostly that's me talking to the probation.
Okay, I have another question for you, sir, and then maybe Dr. Hawkins may have additional information, or Dr. Marlowe. So since your program here in Hawaii accepts sex offenders, are they eligible for early termination as well? And then I would pose to Dr. Hawkins or Doug, are you seeing these types of offenses admitted into a HOPE-like model across the country?
Well, first, as long as they have successfully completed sex offender treatment, they're subject to early termination. As a practical matter, that's rare in 2 years. But as soon as they do get a clinical discharge, they can apply as well. And some places will say, oh, we don't, you know, we're going to try HOPE, but we're not going to put sex offenders in it. And the response is, well, if they're going to be on community supervision, don't you want to watch them closely with consequences for any violation? And they're brought in front of us for any violation. So, for example, at a 2-year drug treatment program we have called Sand Island, a guy was caught hiding in a woman's closet. They let in a few sex offenders at a time into their 2-year program. They kicked him out of the program. They brought it in as a typical motion to revoke. He was in custody. I looked at the facts and circumstances. I told the prosecutor, refile this as a motion to revoke. We came back 2 weeks later, and I gave the guy the 10 years in prison. I was convinced he was going to jump her. This was a public safety matter. But because of this HOPE strategy, that person was brought in front of me for that violation. So if they're going to be on community supervision, we think you want to watch them as close as possible, and that's with consequences. That's all.
And in terms of other jurisdictions, we've seen it's really all over the map. I mean, jurisdictions get to decide which populations they want to have be considered eligible for the program. So some jurisdictions include sex offenders and others do not.
Okay, thank you. Judge Ohm, there's a question that came in about what is the cost per probationer in Hawaii? And I guess what's the timeline?
We do have a long probation period. It used to be 5 years. We did a Justice Reinvestment Initiative, and it got shortened to 4 typically. The average cost for regular probation as usual, is about $1,000 per person per year. In HOPE, it's under 1,500. Our drug court is about 6,300. Prison here is right now $51,000 a year. So all of these alternatives are certainly good if you can make them work and avoid having them go to prison.
Yeah. I'd like just to add to that, I mean, in terms of the legislature's appropriation for HOPE every year, in terms of the marginal cost, the additional cost of HOPE, I mean, it's just over $1 million a year.
Yep.
Divided by, you have 2,300 of them, so it's just over about an additional cost of about $500 per participant. But then most of that money is directed to substance abuse treatment.
Right. And again, drug court at 6,300. If you've got it focused on the right population, a high-risk population, a bunch of those folks otherwise would have gone to prison. And now they're in drug court. Many are being successful. And they often see, this is an opportunity for me. You know, you put in some of the lower risk guys as it used to be, they're like, I'm here because my attorney told me I had to come. These other guys see this is a last chance, this is an opportunity. And with drug courts wraparound services, often they can be successful there too.
Dr. Marlowe, you talked a little bit about matching people to the right services, and I had a question come in that says, how successful can we expect our program to be with a lack of community resources such as treatment or halfway houses or employment opportunities? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of research looking at the effects of giving people, services that they don't need or not giving them services that they do need. And we know that if somebody is assessed as requiring a residential level of treatment and they receive outpatient treatment, the effects are significantly poorer, or sometimes even worse. If somebody needs outpatient treatment and is required to go to residential treatment, the same thing happens, that their outcomes are actually worse. So the point is that just like a good quality hospital would have a whole wide range of wards and people go where their needs call for, if a jurisdiction doesn't have it, if it's a one-size-fits-all and square pegs go into round holes, they get hurt. And that's the issue. So a drug court that doesn't have housing, a HOPE program that doesn't have housing for people who are homeless is going to face substantial difficulties being successful.
Scott, as a probation director in Multnomah County, do you want to talk about what you would do if your community had a lack of resources and how you would go about kind of developing them?
Well, I think it's a very difficult conversation because it has to do both with the money and the politics and the priorities. And I think that one of the things the HOPE Court surfaces for us is that we frequently invest in programs or services that we don't need just because we can. And I think that some of the examples that have been used about being a little more discretion about who you're investing in and what kind of stuff they really need as opposed to everybody needs 5 different things. And I think some of the research, and we can go back to our experts, some of our research would say that if we focus instead on a few key issues and that's where we invest, that allows you to work with a smaller budget.
Thank you, Scott. And we're at the hour and 30-minute mark. I want to give our panelists an opportunity to make a brief closing statement. I'll start with Doug. Any closing comments?
I think that Judge Olm's analogy to a hospital setting for evidence-based practices is brilliant, and frankly, I've been using it for quite some time. If you went to a physician and your physician didn't assess your needs, if your physician put you in treatment and then didn't, for example, a physician put you in treatment for hypertension and didn't take your blood pressure, you would go to a different physician. So if you have a drug problem and people are not testing, if there's no response, if there's no matching of services, that is poor quality practice, and I think that the time has come, using a medical model, to speak of malpractice. That if we're giving people the wrong interventions, we're actually causing harm and wasting money.
Thank you, Doug. Dr. Hawkins?
I want to say, I think if we look back at the experience of Judge Olm in Hawaii, what we really appreciate as an outside team is just his willingness to innovate. If we could clone that willingness to try something new, he designed a program in a very collaborative context with his probation folks, folks on probation, with their treatment providers all at the table. They were trying to troubleshoot for their own jurisdiction and came up with something that worked for them. If we can clone that and get other jurisdictions willing to innovate and try something new and to subject that something new to rigorous testing, the field will be much farther 10 years from now than where we are now.
Thank you, Dr.
Well, one of the questions I get asked as a judge, how many chances do you give people on probation? And my response is, it depends on the way that the probationer is behaving. If they run away repeatedly, they should go to prison. Law enforcement resources should be patrolling our families' neighborhoods, not looking for people who are absconding. But if they're willing to try, even if they're having trouble stopping using, they test positive, they miss an appointment, but they come in, they're not absconding, I will give them repeated chances, because changing thinking to change behavior is really hard. It's easy to send people to prison, but the public thinks you send them to prison, problem solved. They're actually going to spend 2 or 3 years in prison surrounded by other criminals talking about getting high, breaking into our houses, and then they're going to come back to our communities. Are they going to be better or are they going to be worse? And I say this as a judge who has no problem sending people to prison for 10, 20, 30 years if they're violent and dangerous, just to protect us from this. But if they're in the community, in community supervision, I'm going to, suck it up and work with them and talk to them and encourage them and give them a sanction every time, because when we do these early terminations, I'll ask them what changed, and some of the time is, I got sick and tired of going to jail, and I finally realized I got to change my life. So I'm going to give them multiple chances, because otherwise you have to think for each violation, what is society better served, sending them to prison or continuing to work with them? And in many cases, if they're not absconding repeatedly, the answer is I'm going to keep working with them. If they're willing to keep trying, I'm going to keep trying.
Thank you, Judge. Just briefly, we have to wrap up the webinar here today. I want to thank Judge Alm for hosting us. I would like to thank the Federal Probation staff here, Supervisor Tim Jenkins, for graciously hosting us. I'd also like to thank Dr. Marlowe and Dr. Hawken and Scott Taylor and Penny Stinson and the rest of the Community Corrections Collaborative Network. Briefly, the Community Corrections Collaborative Network, you can see some of the links for our position paper, Safe and Smart Ways to Solve America's Correctional Challenges, our survey, and if you have further questions, contact me at gcrawford@bop.gov or visit our website. You can see the link below. Here is who represents the Community Corrections Collaborative Network, and I want to just note a nice quote from Judge Alm to end our webinar here today, that people can change and make better choices in their lives. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a nice day.